they found Dorothy Pell at the bottom of St. Jude's Well just as the first cold light of dawn began to silver the limestone hills of Ashwell Ford, her fingers still loosely framing a cluster of crushed purple foxgloves, and the great mosaic panel of petals she had labored 3 weeks to construct floating unbroken on the dark water above her like a floral tapestry suspended between air and deep earth. The police would spend 3 days looking for an angry man with a heavy boot and an old grudge, missing entirely the 3 truths that lay written in plain sight across the damp stone: that the flowers arranged around her submerged shoulders were not decorative at all but an explicit warning no one had bothered to read in time, that she had died attempting to protect a herd of dairy cattle that belonged to her bitterest competitor, and that the identity of the person who pushed her into the dark had been woven into the very pattern of yellow carnations and rue she had pressed into the clay with her own hands. Hello friends, I'm Jack, broadcasting to you from here in Ohio, where the late summer evening is just turning crisp enough around the edges to make a warm lamp and a cup of tea feel like the finest luxuries in the world. Welcome back to Midnight Pages. Tonight, we travel across the Atlantic to a quiet, stone-built corner of the Peak District, where an ancient village tradition turned out to be the canvas for a remarkably quiet, remarkably cruel crime. Before we begin our story tonight, I'd love to ask you a small question in the comments below. Do you have a favorite flower or plant whose meaning or history you've always found surprising, or perhaps a local tradition in your own hometown that has endured for generations? Take a moment to share your thoughts, settle back into your chair, make yourself completely comfortable, and let us wander down into the stone-walled lanes of Ashwell Ford. Chapter 1: The Village Dresses its Wells. It was the opinion of Miss Euphemia Bright, late senior English mistress at St. Ebbe's Grammar School for Girls and currently an uninvited guest at her niece's cottage in Ashwell Ford, that human beings were never more dangerous than when they believed themselves to be engaged in an innocent act of community goodwill. She had sat upon the low limestone wall outside St. Jude's Well for 40 minutes on Tuesday afternoon, her small leather-bound notebook resting closed in her lap, quietly watching the village prepare for its annual well-dressing festival. The tradition was ancient, meticulous, and extraordinarily damp. Huge wooden frames, 5 feet high and 4 feet wide, packed tight with wet, grey riverbed clay, were laid out on heavy trestle tables beneath green canvas awnings. Into these moist, dark slabs the women of the parish pressed millions of tiny flower petals, mosses, berries, alder cones, and crushed lichen, creating intricate pictorial panels that would later be erected over the village's 3 historic spring heads to be blessed by the vicar. Ashwell Ford was an ancient settlement carved directly into one such ravine, where every cottage, barn, and garden wall seemed to grow organically out of the surrounding limestone rock. In the late summer rain, the village smelled of wet turf, wood smoke, and mountain thyme, and the continuous sound of underground springs cascading through stone channels was the background music to every conversation. Miss Euphemia had spent her life educating the daughters of prosperous merchants and countryside parsons at St. Ebbe's, a calling that required an iron grip on English grammar and an unshakable faith in the underlying foolishness of human nature. Retirement had not dimmed her sharp blue eyes, nor had it dulled her capacity for quiet observation. When her niece Clara had invited her to spend a fortnight in Ashwell Ford to convalesce after a strenuous term, Miss Euphemia had accepted primarily because she knew that small English villages contained far more unvarnished human drama per square yard than any schoolroom in Sussex. The well-dressing festival was the climax of the village year. For weeks prior to the event, the young men of the parish had ventured up into the high peat bogs to gather the grey riverbed clay, keeping it submerged in stone troughs until it reached the exact consistency of thick butter. The timber frames, crafted from heavy English oak, were soaked in the mill pond for 3 days to prevent the wood from drawing moisture out of the clay. It was a process that demanded patience, physical stamina, and a deep, unwritten knowledge of local materials, a knowledge that had been passed down from mother to daughter for generations. It is a form of devotion, Aunt Euphemia, her niece, Clara, had explained earlier that morning with that bright, instructional tone young women so often adopted toward elderly relatives whose intellect they vastly underestimated. A thanksgiving for clean spring water. The Peak District villages have done it since the Black Death in the 14th century, when the hill springs remained pure while all the surrounding lowland parishes suffered terribly from the pestilence. It is an opportunity for Mrs. Abernathy to tell Mrs. Jedge that her hydrangeas are coarse and vulgar, Miss Euphemia had observed mildly, her thumb tracing the worn leather spine of her notebook, a small, deliberate gesture she employed whenever her mind was sifting through something that did not quite balance. And for Mr. Gerald Croft to demonstrate how exceedingly well he looks in a dark blue tweed waistcoat while doing precisely nothing to assist the parish. Gerald Croft, land agent and estate manager for the inherited Pell properties that encompass nearly half the surrounding valley, was standing 10 yards away beside the main wellhead. He was a broad, florid man of 55 whose silvering hair was combed back with a rigid precision that suggested a very high opinion of his own profile. At that moment he was watching Dorothy Pell, the village's undisputed master artist of the flower mosaic, with an expression so fixed, so extraordinarily careful in its pleasantness, that Miss Euphemia's thumb paused on the leather edge. It reminded her instantly of Mr. Henderson, the senior churchwarden at her home parish of Highbury, who had once spent an entire parish council meeting smiling with immense, beaming warmth at a decorative wooden breadboard while quietly sitting upon the only surviving copy of the choir fund audit. When a man took that much trouble to look entirely benign in public, Miss Euphemia had long ago concluded, it was usually because his hands were occupied with something he preferred not to explain to his neighbors. Dorothy Pell herself was 52, spare of frame, with dark hair silvered at the temples and slender hands that were perpetually stained with plant juice and wet black earth. She worked with a fierce, silent intensity, completely ignoring the cheerful chatter of the other women around the trestle tables. She was setting the border of the primary panel, the east face, which was to hang directly over the stone mouth of St. Jude's Well. The Pell family had once been the primary landowners of Ashwell Ford, but 50 years of agricultural depression and heavy death duties had eroded their fortune, leaving Dorothy and her younger sister Marjorie living in the small grey stone cottage near the church, surrounded by family portraits they could no longer afford to gild. Dorothy was an unmarried woman of independent spirit who had devoted her creative life to the well-dressing festival, mastering the delicate art of pressing flower petals into wet clay so precisely that her panels resembled illuminated medieval manuscripts. Dorothy Pell is the only woman left in the parish who remembers the true Victorian ciphers, Clara remarked, leaning against the stone wall beside her aunt. Most of the younger women simply copy pictures out of parish magazines, cottages with smoke coming out of the chimneys, or shepherd boys with lambs. But Dorothy designs her own motifs from old family pattern books that belonged to her grandmother. A dangerous gift, Miss Euphemia murmured, watching Dorothy's dark head bent over the clay. An artist who understands symbols is an artist who can speak to those who know how to listen, while remaining entirely incomprehensible to those who do not. "She's been at it since 6 this morning," whispered Nora Salt, the village postmistress, pausing beside Miss Euphemia's perch with a wicker basket of empty tea mugs. Nora was a short, comfortable woman whose habit was to deliver the most startling pieces of local intelligence as though she were merely commenting on the humidity. "Won't let a single soul touch that east panel, Dorothy won't. Not even her younger sister Marjorie. Mind you, Marjorie's got her hands full with the ham sandwiches in the church hall, but even so. Dorothy's always been particular about her artistic standards, but this year she's like a woman possessed by an itch she can't scratch. A creative impulse, no doubt," Miss Euphemia murmured, her eyes fixed on the clay frame. "Or a worry," Nora said, lowering her voice and leaning down so her floral cotton apron brushed Miss Euphemia's grey wool shoulder. She was in the post office on Monday morning, right after the morning delivery, asking the most peculiar questions about the local water table. Wanted to know if the postman had noticed whether the lower ditch by Thomas Bridges' bottom pasture was running dry or running sour. Now why would a flower dresser care about a dairy farmer's drainage ditch, I ask you? Miss Euphemia did not answer immediately, for at that moment Gerald Croft had taken 3 measured steps toward Dorothy's table. He leaned over the heavy wooden frame, his thumbs tucked neatly into his waistcoat pockets. "Still working on the foxgloves, Dorothy?" he asked. His voice was deep, cultured, and carried that hollow resonance common to men who spent a great deal of time speaking in small rooms to people who could not afford to contradict them. An unusual choice for the primary border of a well-dressing, surely? Traditionalists in the Peak prefer the pale larkspur or the elderberry for a springhead blessing. Dorothy Pell did not look up from her clay. Her slender fingers pressed a bright purple blossom into the grey mud with a small, sharp movement. "The tradition, Gerald, is to use what speaks the true story of the season. Some years require larkspur. This year requires something with a deeper root and a far clearer voice." Croft's jaw tightened, just for a fraction of a second, before the broad, genial smile snapped back into place like a spring-loaded shutter. "Ah well. You are the artist of the parish. We merely pay for the timber frames and bless the result." He turned on his heel and strolled off toward the vicarage path. Miss Euphemia watched him go, then shifted her gaze back to the mosaic. Dorothy had laid a tight, deliberate ring of dark green leaves around the purple bells of the foxglove, and set against them, in stark, glaring contrast, a row of jagged yellow carnation petals. To anyone else in Ashwell Ford, it was simply vivid color. To Miss Euphemia Bright, who had spent 40 years teaching Victorian botanical poetry and the polite floral ciphers of the 19th century to adolescent schoolgirls, it was a sentence written in capital letters. Chapter 2: The Artist at Her Work. By Wednesday evening, the village green of Ashwell Ford had taken on that peculiar, hushed expectancy that precedes a long-awaited rural festival. The 4 great wooden panels were complete, mounted into their heavy oak frames, and stood propped under the canvas tent ready for the dawn procession and the vicar's solemn blessing. In the low-ceilinged taproom of the Lamb and Flag, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of pipe tobacco, damp tweed, burning peat, and stale mild ale. The Lamb and Flag was the social heart of Ashwell Ford, a stone-flagged public house with low oak beams black with 2 centuries of peat smoke. Above the wide stone hearth hung an ancient iron spit and a framed parchment recording the names of the Ashwell Ford men who had marched off to the Crimean War. On the eve of the well-dressing, every bench was crowded with quarrymen from the High Ridge, tenant farmers in damp corduroys, and parish committee members discussing the weather prospects for the morning blessing. Miss Euphemia, who possessed a remarkable talent for looking like a completely harmless elderly lady who had lost her way on the path to the church hall, sat in a dark corner booth with a small glass of dry sherry, quietly observing the room. Across the hearth sat Thomas Bridge, the dairy farmer whose family had worked the low pastures below the limestone ridge for 3 generations. He was a broad-shouldered man of 48 with weathered skin, eyes set deep under heavy dark brows, and the slow, deliberate movements of a man who spent his life waiting on the weather and the seasons. Tonight, however, his hands were far from still. He kept turning a heavy pewter tankard on the polished oak table, round and round, his dark eyes fixed on the heavy latch of the pub door. Thomas was a man who belonged to the high pastures, a man who knew every stone outcrop and sheep track on the ridge, whose family had weathered agricultural depressions, rot in the flocks, and dry summers without ever surrendering a single acre of their ancestral holding. But the sudden, inexplicable sickness that had struck his dairy herd over the past 4 days had shaken him to the core. A dairy farmer without his cows was a man stripped of his purpose, watching his life's work dissolve into dry dust while the bank clock ticked inexorably toward foreclosure. "He's waiting for news of his herd," Clara whispered from across their small table. She had insisted on accompanying her aunt, under the mistaken impression that elderly ladies required protection in public houses. 2 more of his prize cows went down yesterday morning. The vet from Buxton says it's some kind of metabolic poison in the water supply, but he can't name the chemical source. Thomas is nearly ruined, Aunt Euphemia. If he loses his dairy herd, the bank will foreclose on the farm mortgage before Michaelmas. And who holds the mortgage? Miss Euphemia asked softly, her eyes trailing toward the bar, where Gerald Croft was holding court with the parish council chairman. "The Pell Estate Trust," Clara replied in a hushed tone. "Which means Gerald Croft administers it entirely. If Thomas defaults on his payments, the land reverts to the estate, or rather, to Dorothy and Marjorie Pell, though Croft has full power of sale under their father's old will." At that moment, the latch of the heavy oak door lifted with a sharp clatter, and Marjorie Pell entered the pub. She was 8 years younger than her sister Dorothy, with a soft, worried-looking face that had once been pretty and now merely looked anxious, as though beauty had been a garment she had outgrown without quite noticing. She looked quickly around the smoky room, her eyes meeting Thomas Bridges for one brief, terrible second, a look of such acute, silent agony that Miss Euphemia felt a cold stir of interest at the base of her spine, before she turned abruptly toward the bar. "He was sweet on Marjorie Pell 30 years ago," whispered Nora Salt, who had slipped into the booth beside Clara with a small glass of port. "Before old Mr. Pell lost his money in the railway crash and turned sour on the world." The old man told Thomas that a tenant farmer with 40 acres was no match for a Pell daughter, and forbade him the house. Thomas never married, and neither did Marjorie. They've lived 300 yards apart for 30 years, passing each other in the churchyard every Sunday morning without saying more than "Good day, Thomas," and "Good day, Marjorie." But everyone in the parish knows that if Thomas had a trouble, Marjorie's heart bled for it, and if Marjorie needed a hand with her wood pile, Thomas's axe was on the block before she'd even asked. "Gerald," Marjorie said, her voice thin and high against the low murmur of the taproom. "Have you seen Dorothy?" "She isn't at the cottage. Her supper is cold on the grate, her apron is hanging behind the scullery door, and her brass lantern is gone from the shelf." Gerald Croft turned from the bar with an easy, unhurried grace, adjusting his silver cufflinks. "My dear Marjorie, she is almost certainly down at St. Jude's Well making some last-minute adjustment to her precious panels. You know how she is about her work. She would stay up all night with a pair of silver tweezers if she thought one moss cap was leaning half a millimeter to the west." "She isn't there," Marjorie said, her fingers clutching the fringe of her woolen shawl so tightly her knuckles showed white. "I went down to the wellhead 10 minutes ago. The tent flap is loose. The lantern wasn't there, and the spring water was splashing heavily over the flagstones. Then she has gone for a walk up the high ridge to clear her head," Croft said smoothly, taking a slow sip from his glass. "Dorothy is 52 years old, Marjorie, not a stray lamb. She does not require a search party every time she skips her mutton chop." A few men at the bar chuckled nervously, but Thomas Bridge did not join them. He stood up so suddenly his heavy chair scraped sharply against the flagstones. Without a word to anyone in the room, he pulled his heavy oilskin coat from the peg by the door and stepped out into the dark, misting night. Miss Euphemia set down her sherry glass. "Clara, my dear," she said placidly, "I believe I should like a short breath of fresh air before we turn in for the night. My ankles are feeling somewhat stiff from sitting." "Oh, Auntie, it's misting out." "Which is exceptionally good for the complexion," Miss Euphemia snapped gently, already rising and buttoning her grey wool coat to the chin. "Wait here. I shall not be 5 minutes." She slipped out into the cool night air. The village lane was quiet, save for the distant trickle of water from the hillside feeds and the soft, heavy drip of moisture from the lime trees. She did not follow Thomas Bridge down the main track toward the well, but instead took the narrow, muddy path that ran along the rear of the churchyard, a path that offered an elevated view of St. Jude's Well from above. As she reached the low stone stile behind the vicarage barn, she stopped. Down in the hollow, shadowed by the ancient yew trees, the canvas tent over St. Jude's Well was dark. But through the grey drizzle, she could see a faint, yellow glow moving near the ground 50 yards up the slope, not at the well itself, but near the small stone shed that housed the valve mechanism for the old hill pipe, the conduit that carried the overflow water from the spring down toward the valley farms. The light flickered once, twice, as though a lantern were being swung low near the grass, and then went abruptly out. A moment later, she heard the sound of heavy boots squelching rapidly away through the wet turf toward the upper road. Miss Euphemia did not pursue the boots. Instead, she withdrew her small leather notebook, ran her thumb thoughtfully along its spine, and waited in the dark until the church clock struck 10. Chapter 3: A Drowned Crown of Flowers. They found her at 20 minutes past 6 on Thursday morning. It was the sexton, old Arthur Finch, who raised the cry. He had gone down to the wellhead with a broom to sweep the gravel path before the 8 o'clock blessing, only to find the canvas flap of the tent torn away from its ropes and floating in the stone basin. When Miss Euphemia arrived on the scene 20 minutes later, walking at a pace that suggested a gentle morning stroll, though her sharp eyes missed neither the broken elder branch near the gate nor the deep, skidding heel mark in the wet clay, a small, horrified crowd had already gathered behind the police rope. St. Jude's Well sat in a natural limestone hollow shadowed by 3 ancient yew trees whose gnarled branches kept the spring head in perpetual twilight. The water rose from a deep underground cavern, clear as crystal and icy cold even in the height of summer, falling into a circular stone basin 6 feet across that had been carved out of the solid bedrock in 1780. Inspector Vance of the Derbyshire Constabulary was already there. He was a lean, methodical man of 40 with a moustache that looked as though it had been trimmed with a spirit level, and an expression of profound irritation that suggested he considered murder in an English village to be a personal insult to his sense of order. Dorothy Pell's body had been lifted from the basin and lay on a dry canvas top beneath the yew tree. She was dressed in her dark working skirt and a heavy wool cardigan, soaked through with spring water. Her face was pale, serene, almost unblemished save for a faint, bluish bruise along the left jawline. "Drowned," Inspector Vance was saying to Gerald Croft, who stood nearby with his hat held over his chest, looking suitably grave and sorrowful. "Fell forward into the basin, hit her head on the stone lip, and lost consciousness in 3 inches of water." Tragically simple. The flagstones around the wellhead are slick with moss. An absolute tragedy, Croft agreed, his voice low and vibrating with restrained emotion. She was so devoted to the festival. "We urged her not to work late into the night alone, Inspector, but Dorothy was an obstinate woman when it came to her art." Miss Euphemia did not listen to Mr. Croft. She had stepped as close to the stone basin as the young police constable would permit, her sharp blue eyes darting from the drowned woman's body to the decorated panel that hung directly above the water. The east panel, Dorothy's masterwork, was entirely intact. The wooden frame had been secured to the stone archway above the spring, its vibrant surface glistening with dew. But where the bottom edge of the panel met the water, several dozen purple foxglove blossoms had been crushed flat, as though a heavy body had pressed against them before slipping into the dark basin below. And set within that crushed border, clearly visible to anyone who knew how to look, was the sequence Dorothy had finished just hours before her death. Yellow carnations. Foxglove. Rue. And at the very center, framing a picture of the village church, a dense, dark wreath of monkshood. "Inspector," Miss Euphemia said softly. Inspector Vance turned, his eyebrows twitching upward at the intrusion of an unfamiliar elderly woman in a grey coat. "Madam? This is a police scene. I must ask you to stand back behind the rope." "Of course," Miss Euphemia said mildly. "I merely thought you might wish to observe her left hand." Vance frowned, looking down at the body. Dorothy Pell's left hand lay half-curled against her skirt. Clutched tightly between her thumb and forefinger was a small, torn fragment of stiff, oiled canvas, not from the tent flap, which was soft sailcloth, but from something heavy, industrial, and smeared with dark grease. "What is that?" Vance muttered, stepping forward and carefully extracting the scrap with his tweezers. "It appears to be a piece of a gasket," Miss Euphemia offered helpfully, her voice dripping with innocent sweetness. "The sort one uses on heavy water valves, I believe. My late brother had a great fondness for stationary steam engines. One becomes familiar with the smell of high-pressure tallow." Gerald Croft cleared his throat loudly. "Nonsense. It's likely just trash blown down from the road. The village is full of debris during festival week." "Or," Miss Euphemia remarked to nobody in particular, "it was pulled from the pocket of the person who was standing over her when she went into the water." Chapter 4: Foxglove and Yellow Carnation. By noon, the atmosphere in Ashwell Ford had turned from grief to suspicion. Inspector Vance had established a temporary office in the vicarage study, and the parade of witnesses had begun. The obvious suspect had already been identified by the village at large, Thomas Bridge. "It's plain as the nose on your face," declared Mrs. Jedge outside the post office, her basket balanced precariously on her hip. Thomas was seen leaving the Lamb and Flag in a rage at 9 o'clock. He's been overheard saying dreadful things about the Pell family holding his land over his head. And everyone knows Dorothy was the one who refused to allow him an extension on his pasture lease last spring. Miss Euphemia, sitting on a bench beneath the village oak with her notebook in her hand, listened to this chatter with quiet detachment. The parlour at Clara's cottage was a sanctuary of Victorian quietude. Sunlight filtered through white lace curtains, illuminating polished mahogany tables, brass candlesticks, and shelves filled with neatly bound volumes of history and poetry. On the small oval table by the window lay Lady Mary Stanhope's illustrated language of flowers, its faded cloth cover embossed with gold rosebuds. Miss Euphemia had spent 2 hours in her niece's parlour, consulting that small volume. "Foxglove," she whispered to herself, tracing the neatly printed entries. "Digitalis purpurea." Meaning, insincerity. A warning of false intentions. She turned the page. Yellow carnation. Meaning, disdain. Rejection. Clear and absolute refusal. She closed the book with a small, dry snap and ran her thumb along the leather cover. If Dorothy Pell had laid foxglove and yellow carnations around the border of her mosaic, she was not merely decorating a well, she was recording a conversation. A confrontation, more likely. A refusal to accept an insincere offer. At 2 o'clock, Miss Euphemia walked up the lane to the Bridge farm. The farmyard was quiet, save for the low, piteous moaning of 2 dairy cows lying in the straw of the lower barn. Thomas Bridge was standing near the gate, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his hands black with coal tar soap. He looked 10 years older than he had the previous night. "Miss Bright," he said, his voice flat and hollow when he saw her approach. "If you're coming to ask if I killed Dorothy, you can save your shoes. The inspector's already asked me 3 times. I told him the truth. I walked up the hill to look at my top pasture, saw the lights were out at the well, and went home. I did not come to ask if you killed her, Mr. Bridge," Miss Euphemia said gently, resting her hands on the top rail of the gate. "I came to ask about your cattle." Thomas blinked, taken aback. "My cattle?" "The 2 that fell ill yesterday," she said. "Where do they drink?" "From the lower ditch," Thomas said, gesturing vaguely toward the valley bottom. "The feed comes straight down from the St. Jude spring overflow. It's been clean water for 200 years. But since Sunday, the stream's had a greasy look to it. Like someone's been washing engine parts upstream." "And did you mention this to Dorothy Pell?" Thomas hesitated. His jaw worked silently for a moment before he answered. "I tried to. On Monday. I saw her at the well-dressing shed. I told her the water coming off the Pell Hill pipe was killing my stock. She didn't believe me at first, thought I was just complaining about the rent again. But she said she'd look into the valve shed herself." "I see," Miss Euphemia said softly. "And did she speak to Mr. Croft about it?" Thomas's face darkened instantly. "Gerald Croft doesn't listen to farmers, Miss Bright. He listens to balance sheets." If the hill pipe is foul, he'd rather let my cows die than spend £50 clearing the culvert. Miss Euphemia nodded slowly. Mr. Bridge, when you left the pub last night at 9 o'clock, did you pass the stone valve shed behind the churchyard? I did, Thomas admitted, his eyes narrowing. And I saw a light in it. A yellow lantern. I thought it was Arthur Finch checking the overflow, so I kept walking. Was the light moving? No, Thomas said thoughtfully. It was sitting on the floor. And there was a man standing in the doorway, shadowy, like. He was wearing one of those heavy oilskin coats. Gerald Croft wears an oilskin coat, Miss Euphemia observed dryly. So does half the parish, Thomas replied with a bitter laugh. Including me. Chapter 5. What Nora Remembered. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Inspector Vance made his first major error. He called a press briefing outside the village hall and announced that he had detained Thomas Bridge for questioning in connection with certain financial disputes involving the victim. The village accepted the news with a collective, somber nod. It fit the narrative Ashwell Ford preferred: a desperate farmer, an overdue debt, a violent argument in the dark. Miss Euphemia, however, was sitting in the back parlour of the post office, drinking tea with Nora Salt. The post office at Ashwell Ford was a small, low-ceilinged shop that smelled of paraffin, printed paper, licorice sweets, and damp woolens. Behind the wooden counter sat Nora Salt, her brass spectacles perched on her nose, weighing parcel post on a set of heavy iron scales. It's wrong, Nora said flatly, setting her teapot down with a clatter that rattled the china cups. Thomas Bridge wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone Dorothy Pell. He was sweet on her sister Marjorie when they were young, you know, before old Mr. Pell put a stop to it because Thomas didn't have enough acreage. Thomas has been protective of those sisters his whole life. Has he? Miss Euphemia said, her eyes sharp above her cup. Always, Nora affirmed. And another thing, Dorothy came in here on Tuesday morning, right after she'd been up to that valve shed. She was shaking like a leaf, Miss Bright. She bought 3 sheets of writing paper and a bottle of black ink, and she said to me, Nora, if anything happens to the lower pasture, you tell the vicar to check the parish boundary map from 1892. The one in the vestry chest. Miss Euphemia set her cup down. The 1892 map? Why that specific map? She didn't say, Nora replied. Just said old maps don't lie, even when land agents do. 10 minutes later, Miss Euphemia was in the parish church. The building was cool, smelling of beeswax, damp stone, and old hassocks. The parish vestry was a small, vaulted chamber behind the chancel, smelling of ancient leather, beeswax, and damp stone. In its iron-bound oak chest rested 200 years of parish records, tithe maps, baptismal registers, and boundary disputes that recorded the long, quiet struggle between land agents and tenant farmers. The vicar, Reverend Cook, was sitting in his vestry, looking thoroughly miserable over a cup of lukewarm tea. Miss Bright, he said, rising hurriedly. A tragic business. Most dreadful. Poor Dorothy. And poor Thomas, though if he is guilty, of course, justice must be served. Reverend Cook, Miss Euphemia interrupted briskly, I should be immensely obliged if you would allow me to inspect the 1892 parish boundary map. The vicar blinked. The boundary map? My dear lady, it's merely a legal record of tithe allocations. Most dry. I have a great affection for dry records, Miss Euphemia said with a polite, unyielding smile. They so rarely invent stories to suit their own convenience. Reluctantly, the vicar unlocked the heavy iron-bound chest in the corner and withdrew a large, rolled canvas map, stiff with age. He laid it flat across the vestry table. Miss Euphemia leaned over it, her spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose. Her fingers traced the thin red line that marked the boundary between the Pell estate and the Bridge farm. There, right at the junction of the two properties behind St. Jude's Well, was a small, hand-drawn symbol, a circle with a cross through it, labelled St. Jude's Deep Feeder, Private Conduit, Pell and Bridge Joint Right, 1844. And written beneath it, in fine copperplate script, was a note. Note: the underground divert valve within the stone shed controls the flow to both the lower pasture ditch and the estate reservoir. Should the valve be closed to the east, the entire flow is directed into the lower ditch. Should it be turned to the west, the water is diverted exclusively to the private estate land intended for residential development. Miss Euphemia stood up straight. Her eyes were bright with a fierce, cold clarity. "Reverend," she asked quietly, "has Mr. Gerald Croft been attempting to sell the estate's upper acreage to the Buxton Housing Syndicate?" The vicar looked nervously toward the vestry door. "Well, there have been inquiries. Preliminary discussions. But Thomas Bridges' water rights were an obstacle. The syndicate will not purchase land unless they can guarantee exclusive water access for 50 villas. And if Thomas Bridges' farm were to fail, if his cattle died and he defaulted on his mortgage, his water rights would lapse back to the Pell estate, would they not?" Reverend Cook went very pale. I believe that is the legal construction of the deed, yes." "Thank you, Reverend," Miss Euphemia said, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "You have been exceptionally illuminating." Chapter 6: Monkshood's Warning. That evening, as the shadows lengthened across the village green, Miss Euphemia returned to the festival tent to examine the mosaic once more. The police guard had been reduced to a single board constable standing near the road. Miss Euphemia walked straight past him with the authoritative air of a parish inspector checking for dry rot, and stood before the south panel. As twilight fell over the village green, the great festival tent took on a mysterious, cathedral-like quiet. The fir-flower panels stood propped against their oak frames, their vibrant colors glowing dimly in the failing light, holding the secret of Dorothy Pell's final hours. This panel, the one Dorothy had constructed on Tuesday afternoon, featured a central motif of deep blue monkshood, Aconitum napellus, surrounded by a bitter yellow border of rue to gravelins. Miss Euphemia mentally opened her little book of floral meanings. "Monkshood," she murmured. "Meaning, a deadly foe is near. Beware of treachery." "And rue," she added softly. "Meaning, regret. Remorse for a fatal hesitation." She sat down on the wooden bench opposite the panel and closed her eyes, letting her mind construct the scene as it must have occurred. Dorothy Pell had gone to the stone valve shed on Monday. She had used her lantern to inspect the old iron mechanism. She had found that someone with heavy tools and grease on his hands, had deliberately fitted a bypass valve, diverting the clean spring water away from Thomas Bridges' pastures and pumping toxic, stagnant runoff from the old lead mine tailings into the lower ditch to poison his herd. She had realized instantly what Gerald Croft was doing. He was quietly destroying Thomas Bridges' livelihood to force a land sale that would net him thousands of pounds in commission. Dorothy had confronted Croft on Tuesday morning at the well-dressing table. She had used the language of flowers, the only language she trusted in a village where Croft held all the economic power, to tell him she knew. She had set Foxglove, insincerity, and yellow carnation, rejection, into the clay right under his nose. Croft had understood the warning. He had realized that Dorothy was not merely an eccentric artist, she was a witness who held the key to his ruin. And so, late on Wednesday night, he had met her at the well. Miss Euphemia opened her eyes. She did not fall, she said aloud to the empty tent. She was shown the valve, she refused to stay silent, and she was pushed. At that moment, a quiet footstep sounded on the gravel behind her. Miss Euphemia turned her head slowly. Marjorie Pell was standing in the entrance of the tent. She was wearing her dark morning coat, her eye swollen with crying, her lips trembling. "Miss Bright," Marjorie whispered, coming forward and sitting beside the older woman on the wooden bench. "The inspector says Thomas will be formally charged tomorrow morning. They found a greasy wrench in his barn. A wrench that was placed there 3 hours ago, no doubt," Miss Euphemia said calmly. "Marjorie, my dear, I must ask you a very direct question, and I require a very direct answer." Marjorie wiped her eyes with a damp handkerchief. "Anything. Where were you between 8 o'clock and 10 o'clock last night?" Marjorie froze. Her color drained away entirely. I was at the cottage." "You were not," Miss Euphemia said firmly, her thumb tracing the spine of her notebook. "You came into the Lamb and Flag at 9:30 looking for Dorothy. But before that, between 8 and 9, you were seen walking up the lane toward the high pasture. Were you with Thomas Bridge?" Marjorie gasped, covering her face with her hands. "If I tell the police, they will say he bribed me to lie for him." "They will say no such thing if the truth is told clearly," Miss Euphemia insisted. "Were you with him?" "Yes." Marjorie sobbed. "We were in the upper barn from 8:20 until 9 o'clock. Thomas was trying to save his calf, it was born sick because of the water. He never left my sight for a single minute during that hour. He couldn't have been at the well when Dorothy died. He couldn't." "Then Thomas has an absolute alibi," Miss Euphemia said, her voice softening. "And the west panel of your sister's mosaic is proven correct." Marjorie looked up, bewildered. "The west panel?" "Ivy and forget-me-not," Miss Euphemia said, pointing toward the third wooden frame. "Fidelity and true love. Dorothy knew you loved Thomas, Marjorie. She put those flowers there to tell the world that your loyalty to him was pure. She was protecting both of you." Chapter 7: The Second Sickness. At 7 o'clock on Friday morning, the case took its second dramatic turn. Miss Euphemia was having breakfast with her niece when Nora Salt burst into the kitchen without knocking, her apron half untied, her face flushed with excitement. "Miss Bright! Clara! You must come quickly. It's happened again. Has someone else been hurt?" Clara exclaimed, dropping her toast. "No, but Thomas Bridges' remaining cows, the 4 prize heifers in the upper meadow, they're all down on their sides, foaming at the mouth. And Thomas is locked in the police cell in Buxton. He couldn't have done it. The morning air was thick with the scent of wet grass and cold limestone as the farmers gathered outside the village hall. The news of the second sickness had spread like wildfire through the valley, turning quiet concern into fierce, demanding anger. Inspector Vance, who had just arrived back in the village to finalize his arrest report, was met at the village hall by an angry crowd of 30 farmers and villagers. "If Thomas is in jail," shouted old Arthur Finch from the front rank, "who's poisoning the water this morning, Inspector? Answer us that." Vance looked thoroughly shaken. His spirit-level moustache twitched violently as he tried to maintain order. "Now see here, everyone, this may simply be a delayed effect of the earlier contamination." "It is nothing of the sort," a calm, clear voice cut through the clamor. Miss Euphemia Bright stepped forward through the crowd. She was holding a small glass jam jar filled with dark, murky water, which she held up to the sunlight. "This sample was taken from the Hill Pipe outlet 10 minutes ago," she announced to the crowd. "It contains high concentrations of iron sulfate and tallow lubricant." The valve in the stone shed behind the church was opened again at 5 o'clock this morning. Inspector Vance glared at her. "Madam, I must insist that you stop interfering in police matters." "Inspector Vance," Miss Euphemia said, her voice dropping into that terrifyingly quiet, precise register she had once used to silence 50 rebellious schoolgirls in the St. Ebbe's Assembly Hall. "If you will accompany me to the stone valve shed for 5 minutes, I shall demonstrate to you precisely who opened that valve and who killed Dorothy Pell." Vance hesitated, looking at the hostile faces of the villagers around him. He realized, with the quick instinct of a career policeman, that his professional reputation in the county was hanging by a very slender thread. "Very well," he snapped. 5 minutes. "But if this is an elderly delusion, Miss Bright, I shall have you removed from the parish." "An entirely fair bargain," Miss Euphemia said placidly, turning toward the churchyard path. Chapter 8, Ivy on the Third Face. The procession that walked up the churchyard path consisted of Inspector Vance, 2 young constables, Miss Euphemia, and at Miss Euphemia's explicit request, Mr. Gerald Croft, who had been summoned from his office at the estate agency. Croft looked immaculate as ever in his grey tweed suit, though his eyes darted nervously toward the stone shed as they approached the yew trees. "Really, Inspector," Croft said, smoothing his lapels, "I must protest this circus. The old lady is clearly distressed by the tragedy and is indulging in wild village gossip." "We shall see," Vance said grimly. The stone valve shed behind the churchyard was an ancient structure built over the spring overflow, its walls covered in dark green ivy and its heavy oak door fitted with an iron latch that had rusted in the damp hill air. Miss Euphemia stopped outside the heavy oak door of the valve shed. The iron padlock hanging from the latch had been broken off and lay in the wet grass. "Observe the lock, Inspector," Miss Euphemia said. "It was forced this morning with a heavy iron bar. But look closely at the rusted latch itself. There is no fresh rust on the broken iron. This lock was broken 3 days ago, on Monday, when Dorothy Pell first inspected the interior." She turned to Gerald Croft. "You told the inspector yesterday, Mr. Croft, that you had not visited this shed in 6 months. Is that correct?" Croft held himself stiffly. "Entirely correct. I have maintenance men to handle the plumbing." "Then it will doubtless surprise you," Miss Euphemia said, stepping into the dim, damp interior of the shed, "to learn that your private monogrammed silver cufflink, the one featuring the Pell family crest, which you reported missing on Tuesday, is currently resting at the bottom of the secondary overflow tank." Croft's face went grey, a peculiar, mottled ash grey that aged him 10 years in a single second. That is an outrageous lie. I lost that cufflink at the vicarage garden party." "Did you?" Miss Euphemia asked mildly. She reached into her pocket and withdrew her small leather notebook, opening it to a marked page. "On Tuesday afternoon, at 3 o'clock, I sat on the wall outside St. Jude's Well and watched you speak to Dorothy Pell. You were wearing both cuff links. I noted the fact in my diary because I observed that the left link was loose and caught twice on your waistcoat braid." Inspector Vance turned his head slowly toward Croft. His eyes had gone very cold. "Is this true, Mr. Croft?" "She's a senile old biddy." Croft spat out, his refined voice cracking into a harsh, ugly rasp. "You're taking the word of an itinerant spinster over a magistrate of the county." "I am taking the word of a lady who notices details," Vance said quietly. He gestured to his constables. "Constable, drain the secondary tank." Chapter 9, The North Panel. 20 minutes later, the secondary overflow tank had been pumped out with the village fire handrig. Inside the shed, the silence was broken only by the steady, rhythmic drip of water into the iron cistern. Miss Euphemia stood amidst the grey stone and damp shadow, her voice steady and unhurried as she laid bare the greedy calculation that had brought ruin to the Pell estate. At the bottom of the iron cistern, lying in 2 inches of dark sludge alongside a discarded grease can, was a heavy silver cufflink bearing the Pell crest, and wrapped around its stem was a thin, crushed scrap of purple foxglove stem. Gerald Croft stood between the 2 constables, his hands clenched into tight fists, his breathing heavy and ragged. Miss Euphemia stood before him, her hands folded over her coat, her expression fixed in a look of deep, sorrowful disappointment, the look of a schoolmistress who had caught a previously favored pupil in a particularly mean-spirited lie. "You see, Mr. Croft," she said softly, "Dorothy Pell knew her flowers. She spent her life studying what they meant to people. When she discovered what you were doing to the water, when she realized you were deliberately poisoning Thomas Bridges' land so you could sell the upper pasture to the Buxton Syndicate for £20,000, she gave you every opportunity to repent. She was a foolish, meddling old woman," Croft hissed through his teeth. "She was a righteous woman," Miss Euphemia corrected him gently. "She built her mosaic as a public testimony. East panel, foxglove and yellow carnation, she showed the village your insincerity and her absolute rejection of your bribes. South panel, Monkshood and rue, she declared that a deadly foe was working treachery in Ashwell Ford, and that she regretted not exposing you instantly. West panel, ivy and forget-me-not, she recorded the fidelity of her sister and Thomas Bridge, establishing their innocence before the crime was even committed. And the north panel." Miss Euphemia paused, looking toward the final canvas tent where the 4th panel stood waiting for the morning procession. "Hemlock and marigold. Death and grief." She knew, when she went to meet you at the well on Wednesday night to give you your last chance to turn off the valve, that you were capable of murder. Croft looked down at the flagstones. The easy, polished charm had vanished entirely, leaving behind only the small, sour core of a greedy man who had run out of evasions. She wouldn't listen, Croft whispered, his voice barely audible above the drip of the spring. I offered her a third share of the syndicate payout. £10,000. Enough for her and Marjorie to live like ladies in Torquay for the rest of their lives. And she called me a thief. She said she'd rather see the Pell name in the bankruptcy court than see Thomas Bridge ruined by dirty water. And so you pushed her, Inspector Vance said quietly. Croft's head dropped. She slipped. I grabbed her coat, she pulled away, she fell backward into the basin. I didn't mean for her to drown. I just wanted her to stop talking. You left her in 3 inches of water, Mr. Croft, Miss Euphemia said, her voice dropping into a tone of chilling finality. And then you went back to the valve shed to turn the toxic feed back on, so that Thomas Bridge would be blamed for the crime. That is not an accident. That is calculation. Inspector Vance stepped forward, withdrawing a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. Gerald Croft, I am arresting you for the murder of Dorothy Pell. Chapter 10, A Quiet Word with Mr. Croft. The formal confession was signed in the vicarage study at 4 o'clock that afternoon, written out in Inspector Vance's neat, copperplate hand while Gerald Croft sat staring silently at the inkwell. The vicarage study was quiet as the late afternoon light streamed through the diamond-paned windows. Gerald Croft sat motionless in his chair, staring at his signed confession as though he could not quite comprehend how so small a slip had undone 40 years of public standing. There was no dramatic scene, no shouting, no heroic chase through the village lanes. It ended, as Miss Euphemia had always known such matters ended, in a quiet room with a clock ticking softly on the mantelpiece and a guilty man realizing that the magnificent structure of deceit he had spent months building had dissolved into a few lines of plain truth on a piece of blue police paper. Outside in the village green, the sun had finally broken through the Peak District mist, illuminating the grey stone cottages and casting long, golden rays across the square. Miss Euphemia sat on the bench outside the churchyard, her notebook resting in her lap. Marjorie Pell and Thomas Bridge were standing together near the east panel. They were not speaking, but Thomas was holding Marjorie's hand, his broad, calloused fingers wrapped tightly around hers as they looked up at Dorothy's finished work. The purple foxgloves glistened in the afternoon light. The yellow carnations blazed like small suns against the grey clay. A remarkable piece of work, said a quiet voice beside her. Miss Euphemia looked up. Inspector Vance had walked over from the vicarage, his hat in his hand. He looked tired, but the irritation had left his eyes. "The mosaic, Inspector?" she asked. "Both," Vance said, offering her a brief, respectful nod. "The mosaic and your reading of it. I am not ashamed to admit, Miss Bright, that I would have locked up the wrong man today had you not insisted on looking at the flowers. People rarely look at flowers with any real attention, Inspector," Miss Euphemia said mildly, running her thumb along the leather spine of her book. "They consider them decorative. They forget that before men learned to write contracts in law offices, they recorded their true feelings in gardens." "And your churchwarden friend?" Vance asked with a faint smile. "The one with the audit under his trousers?" "Mr. Henderson?" Miss Euphemia chuckled softly. "He spent 3 years in Lincoln Gaol. And his wife subsequently built the finest rose garden in the parish." Sorrow often produces an extraordinary yield of tea roses. Chapter 11. The Last Festival. On Saturday morning, the well-dressing festival of Ashwell Ford went forward as it had for 300 years. The Saturday morning sun broke brightly through the Peak District mist, washing the stone cottages of Ashwell Ford in warm golden light. The village green was alive with the sound of church bells and the cheerful voices of visitors walking from spring to spring. The vicar blessed St. Jude's Well at 9 o'clock, his voice carrying clearly across the quiet crowd that packed the hollow. The water running from the stone spout was crystal clear, cold, and sweet, cascading down the mossy channels toward the valley pastures below. Dorothy Pell's panels hung over the fir springs of the parish, their colors brilliant against the dark limestone. Villagers and visitors from Buxton walked slowly from well to well, admiring the intricate patterns of moss and petal, speaking in low, respectful tones of the artist who had given her life to complete them. Miss Euphemia Bright stood near the gate of her niece's cottage, her small carpet bag packed and sitting beside her on the bench, waiting for the morning omnibus to the station. Clara came out of the kitchen carrying a small basket wrapped in a white napkin. "Aunt Euphemia," she said, her voice filled with a new, quiet respect. "Nora Salt brought these for your journey. Fresh scones and blackberry jam." "How very thoughtful of Nora," Miss Euphemia said, taking the basket. "She is a woman of excellent judgment. She knows precisely when to offer a scone and when to hold her tongue. She looked down the lane one last time." In the distance, near the lower pasture gate, Thomas Bridge was driving his fur-recovered heifers out into the sweet green grass. Beside the fence stood Marjorie Pell, leaning against the timber rail, watching the cattle move into the sun. There was no triumph in the air, only the slow, quiet return of a village to its ancient rhythm, tinged with that soft melancholy that always follows a storm. Miss Euphemia picked up her bag, smoothed her grey gloves, and turned toward the road as the omnibus rounded the bend. "Thank you so much for spending this hour with us here on Midnight Pages. I hope tonight's journey into the Peak District brought a little quiet mystery and warmth to your evening. If you enjoyed our time in Ashwell Ford, please consider giving this video a like, leaving a comment below with your thoughts on Dorothy's floral code, and subscribing to the channel so we can gather here again next week for another long-form cozy mystery. Until then, from all of us here in Ohio, stay warm, keep a lamp burning in the window, and have a very peaceful night.